Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to break down one of the biggest keys to success in October elk hunting, and that's identifying bedding to feeding patterns. September may feel like the Super Bowl of elk hunting with all the calling, bugling, and chaos, but by October, the game changes completely. The rut is winding down. Cows are scattered into smaller groups, and the bulls that were running themselves ragged are focused on one thing: survival. If you've ever hunted October elk and felt like they just vanished, this episode is for you. The truth is, they didn't disappear, they just got quieter and a whole lot smarter. October elk are about conserving energy, finding security cover, and moving predictably between bedding and feeding areas. If you can dial into those patterns, where they bed and what they're eating, and the exact travel routes in between, you'll not only find elk, you'll put yourself in position for a high odds encounter when most hunters are back at camp wondering what went wrong. In this episode, we'll break down how October behavior shifts from September, how bedding and feeding locations change with weather and hunting pressure, how to use terrain and wind to predict their travel routes, and the strategies that put you in the right place at the right time. Let's get started. October is the month of transition. By the time you flip the calendar from September to October, the rut is already tapering off. Those screaming bulls you chased in September are no longer blowing the tops off ridges. Instead, they've gone quiet, broken away from big herds, and started slipping into recovery mode. That change alone is enough to frustrate a lot of hunters. But here's the reality. Elk are still out there. They're just living differently. The cows are drifting back into smaller groups, often splitting into units of half a dozen or less. They're no longer bunched up under the dominance of a single herd bull. Instead, they're focused on feed quality and security, two things that become their top priorities once breeding slows down. The bulls, especially the older herd bulls, are worn down. Imagine dropping 20 to 30% of your body weight in just a few weeks of chasing cows, fighting rivals, and barely eating. That's what October bulls are dealing with. They're beat up, worn thin, and running low on reserves. That's why you'll find many of them separating from cow groups and slipping into secluded bedding areas where they can rest and rebuild. Some will stay solitary. Others might drift with smaller bachelor groups again, but either way, their focus is different: recover, feed, and survive the winter that's coming. October weather also plays a huge role in this transition. Early in the month, temperatures can still be warm, and elk will stick to shady north slopes and thick timber during the day, venturing out to feed in the cool mornings and evenings. As frost sets in and snow starts dusting the high country, elk will begin to move lower, following the best available feed, right? This shift often coincides with hunting pressure as well. By October, every basin and ridge has been stomped by hunters. Elk that were vocal and visible in September are now tight-lipped and slipping into the thickest cover they can find. This is where understanding bedding to feeding patterns becomes critical. Instead of relying on bugles to give away their position, you need to think like an elk in recovery mode. Where's the safest bedding cover that's close enough to quality feed? What ridge lines or drainages offer the best security corridors to travel between the two? Once you start seeing October through that lens, the silence of the mountains stops being discouraging and starts pointing you towards high odds ambushes and intercept opportunities. If you want to understand October elk, you have to first understand where they lay their head down during the day. Bedding areas are the anchor points of an elk's daily life. Every morning and every evening, their movements are tied directly to where they feel secure enough to bed. In September, you can sometimes cheat the system. Elk are distracted, running ridges, chasing cows, and bugling their lungs out. But in October, bedding security is the top priority. If you crack the code on where elk are bedding, you've already solved half the puzzle. October bedding tends to look different than September a lot of times. Early in the season, bulls may bed closer to cow groups, often in areas where they can still keep tabs on the herd. But by October, many of those bulls are peeling off and seeking solitude. That usually means they're sliding into the nastiest cover available: dark north-facing timber, thickly timbered benches and remote pockets of deadfall where they can disappear. Cows, on the other hand, are bedding in smaller family groups, often choosing areas close to dependable feed, still within enough shade and security to keep them comfortable throughout the day. Elevation plays a huge role in bedding patterns as well. In early October, you may still find elk bedding fairly high, especially if the weather is warm and the snow hasn't pushed them down yet. But as the month progresses, they'll begin to drop in elevation, often shifting to mid-slope benches and drainages that offer a balance of cover and access to lower elevation feed. These bedding zones are rarely out in the open. Elk will use finger ridges, small basins, and benches tucked against steep country where the wind and thermals give them an advantage. Slope and aspect matter too. Elk love north and east facing slopes during warm weather because they offer shade and cooler temperatures. As the month gets colder, bedding on south facing slopes becomes more common, especially on sunny afternoons when elk can soak up the warmth. A common October pattern is elk bedding high on a shaded slope in the morning, then shifting slightly to a sunlit bench as the day warms. Thermals are another key piece of the bedding puzzle. Elk use wind as security blankets. They prefer bedding areas where downhill thermals in the morning and uphill thermals in the afternoon provide consistent scent coverage. A bull that slips into a dark timber bench where he can smell the drainage and hear anything coming, that's the ultimate safety zone. When you find those spots, mark them in your mind or on your onX. That's where October bulls will hole up. Finally, don't overlook human pressure when it comes to bedding habits. October, elk have been hunted for weeks, right? They've been bumped, called to, and pressured from every angle. This makes them prioritize bedding areas with escape routes. They want deadfall tangles, steep side hills, and thick timber where they can vanish at the first sign of trouble. These aren't the pretty glassable basins of early September. They're the ugly, hard-to-reach places most hunters don't want to go. If you're willing to get into those dark, nasty pockets and scout those overlooked benches, you'll find the October beds that hold the elk everyone else swears have disappeared. When you put all of this together, elevation, slope, thermals, cover, and pressure, you start to see bedding as more than just where elk lie down. You see it as the core of their survival strategy in October. And if you know where they bed, you can predict the exact routes they'll use to travel to feed, which sets up ambush opportunities we'll talk about later. Once you understand where elk are bedding in October, the next step is figuring out what they're keying on for food. Feeding areas drive their entire daily routine, right? Elk bed for security, but they move for groceries. And in October, the menu changes from what you saw in September. During the peak of summer and early September, lush mountain grasses and forbs are their mainstay, right? That's the key to the diet. Meadows are green, alpine basins are rich, and bulls will graze entirely in the open because calories are easy to come by. By October, most of those high country grasses have cured. Frost has burned off the tender growth, forbs dry up, and the once green meadows turn into pale, empty openings that no longer provide what the elk need. So what does that mean for us as hunters? It means elk shift to lower quality but more available feed. They'll start browsing more heavily on shrubs, woody plants, and even young aspen shoots and bitterbrush, chokecherry, serviceberry, all to play bigger roles in their diet, right? Those things are going to become the staple. In timbered areas, elk will strip needles and bark from fir and even nibble on willow and creek bottoms. They're opportunistic and they'll take whatever nutrition is available. Regional differences also matter in October. In high country habitats, elk still may be feeding on what little green feed lingers along streams and seeps, but you'll notice them moving down to lower benches and drainages earlier in the evening. In more agricultural areas or near winter range, October elk often stage on the edge of hayfields or alfalfa pivots under the cover of darkness. Then they'll transition into the bedding later. They rarely spend daylight in those open areas, but their trails into and out of the fields will be beaten down and easy to spot if you know what to look for. October weather sharpens these shifts. Early snows can push elk down quickly, concentrating them on south-facing slopes where grasses stay open longer. Cold nights drive elk to feed heavier in the mornings and evenings to stoke their metabolism, while warm afternoons may keep them bedded until the last sliver of daylight. A hunter who understands these rhythms can predict not only what elk are eating, but exactly when they'll be moving to it. One more factor that can't be ignored is hunting pressure. By October, elk that have been harassed in open meadows all September are far less likely to step into those same spots in daylight. Instead, they'll browse inside the timber edges or feed on smaller, tucked away openings that a lot of hunters never glass. Sometimes it's as subtle as a 3-acre meadow buried in a drainage or a thin strip of grass along a creek bottom. Those overlooked pocket groceries become magnets for pressured October elk. So when you're scouting for October hunts, don't just look for the big obvious meadows, right? Pay attention to small benches with fresh grass, hidden patches of bitterbrush, or secluded aspen pockets. Fresh tracks, poop, and clipped shrubs tell you where elk are feeding. Once you find those spots and tie them to nearby bedding areas, you've connected the dots of October elk behavior. And that's what allows you to predict their travel routes and set up in the right place before they ever know you're there. Now that we've covered where elk bed and what they're feeding on in October, the real money is made in the middle, right? Their travel routes. Elk live on a pattern of bedding to feeding, feeding to bedding. Those transition lines are the highways of October elk hunting, and if you can pinpoint them, you can stack the odds in your favor. In October, elk don't wander as randomly as they seem to in September. During the rut, bulls may chase cows across ridges, cut drainages, or move at all hours of the day. That chaos is gone now. Instead, their movements become more disciplined, more predictable, and more rooted in efficiency. They want to move as little as possible while still getting food and staying safe. These travel corridors almost always follow terrain features that give elk cover and security. Think about benches that connect a shady bedding slope to a grassy opening below. Think about finger ridges that drop from high timber down to willow-lined creeks. Elk rarely take the most direct line. Instead, they use routes that let them move with cover, keep the wind in their favor, and avoid exposing themselves unnecessarily. Pressure shapes these routes even more. By October, every basin has boot tracks and bugle tubes have echoed through the hills. Elk that once used wide open meadows to move between bedding and feeding will now cut through heavy timber edges, drop into secondary drainages, or side hill through cover to stay out of sight. The travel patterns may still exist, but they shift just enough to avoid hunters. That's why paying attention to the fringe sign, tracks, poop, rubs, and faint trails in unexpected places can show you pressured elk are still connecting the dots. Elevation changes matter here too. Early October elk may only move a few hundred feet between high bedding benches and lower feeding meadows, but as weather and snow push them down, those movements can stretch. By mid to late October, it's common to see elk bedding 1,000 feet higher than their main feed and traveling long distances at night to get there. For hunters, this means paying attention to saddles, finger ridges, and mid-slope trails that serve as funnels between the elevation points. Wind and thermals are another constant factor. Elk don't just march in to feed blindly. They move with a purpose and always keep their nose working for them. If you understand the rhythm of thermals, you can anticipate not only where elk are traveling, but how they'll approach those routes at different times of day. Thermals are going to be dropping overnight and throughout the early morning. After the sun heats the earth, they're going to start to rise and usually be consistent throughout the day, depending on, rain and snow and things of that nature that might cool the landscape. What this means for us as hunters is simple. October success doesn't come from calling elk in, but from intercepting them along the bedding to feeding corridors, right? Find the faint trails cutting through timber edges. Look for dung piles that show consistent use. Glass side hills at last light and trace their routes back toward cover. Once you identify those lines of travel, you can set up ambushes that feel almost unfair because you're not hoping elk might wander by. You're hunting exactly where they have to go. One of the biggest mistakes a lot of guys make in October is misjudging when elk are actually on the move. In September, you can hear bugles all night and watch bulls push cows in daylight. By October, though, the timing tightens up. Elk aren't wasting daylight hours running wild anymore. They're conserving energy and their movement windows get narrower. If you don't understand when they're moving between bedding and feeding, you'll be sitting in the right place at the wrong time. Morning movement in October is often shorter and more subtle than in September. Elk feed through the night under the cover of darkness, and as the sun starts to rise, they're already easing their way back toward bedding areas. Instead of being strung out across open meadows at first light, they might only give you 20 to 30 minutes of visible activity before slipping into the timber. That means if you're strolling into position at legal shooting light, you're already late. Smart October hunters are in place before dawn, set up along travel routes that lead back to bedding cover. Evening movement is usually the stronger play in October. As the sun drops and thermals start pulling downhill, elk rise from their beds and drift toward feeding areas. But here's the catch. They don't come out early unless conditions are perfect. If it's warm, if the moon is bright, or if there's been heavy pressure, elk will often wait until the very last sliver of light before stepping into the open. Sometimes they won't leave the timber until full dark. That's why intercepting them closer to bedding cover can be more effective than waiting out in big open meadows where they feed at night. The moon phase also plays a role in timing here. A full moon in October can mean elk feed heavily all night under bright conditions, then stay bedded longer in the morning and rise later in the evening. It doesn't mean they stop moving, it just shifts the timing further into low light windows. On darker nights with less moonlight, you'll often see them on their feet earlier in the evening and moving later in the morning. Temperature is another driver here. Cold mornings usually spark earlier movement as elk feed to fuel their metabolism. On warm afternoons, movement may be delayed until the absolute edge of darkness. Snow cover changes everything again. A fresh snow can push elk to feed harder and longer, sometimes giving you extended windows of movement even in daylight. Pressure is the final and most consistent factor. By October, elk are survivors. They've been called at, chased, and shot at for weeks. They quickly learn that daylight movement in open areas equals danger. The heavier the pressure, the more nocturnal their patterns become. In some places, October elk may move almost entirely at night, with daylight movement limited to a few hundred yards between bedding and staging areas. In those conditions, the hunter who focuses on those short transition windows inside of cover will see more elk than the guy waiting in wide open meadows. So if you want to line up your October hunts with real opportunity, you got to adjust your clock. Get into ambush locations well before daylight, not at shooting light. Plan on sitting through the last 30 minutes of shooting hours instead of packing it in early. And understand that elk movement in October is about efficiency. They're still traveling between bed and feed, but they're doing it on tighter schedules and with a lot more caution. Hunt those narrow windows with discipline and you'll find yourself in bow or rifle range when other hunters are walking out empty-handed. If there's one law of elk hunting that never changes, no matter if it's September or October, it's this. Elk live and die by the wind. And in October, when calling isn't effective anymore and movement windows are short, your ability to understand terrain and how wind interacts with it will determine whether you get a shot or go home empty-handed. Let's start with terrain. Elk don't move randomly across the landscape. They use it to their advantage. Ridges, benches, saddles, and drainages aren't just features on a map. They're travel corridors, bedding sanctuaries, and escape routes. In October, elk lean even harder on terrain because they're trying to conserve energy and avoid hunters. They'll side hill instead of climbing straight. They'll hug benches that give them consistent travel lines, and they'll use drainages to cover long distances with minimal effort and maximum security. Saddles become especially important in October. A saddle between two drainages is a perfect transition point. Elk use it to move between bedding and feeding areas without exposing themselves on open ridges. If you can find a saddle that connects cover to food, you've got a natural choke point where elk are almost guaranteed to funnel. Now let's layer in the wind. Thermals are predictable, but only if you know how to read them. In the morning, the cool air is still sinking from overnight. It's pulling your scent downhill. By late morning, as the sun warms the ground, thermals switch and begin to rise throughout the rest of the day. In the evening, as shade cools off the air and the earth, thermals start to fall again. Elk know this better than we do, so they bed where they can take advantage of steady thermals that protects them, and they'll travel when the wind is working in their favor. October winds can be tricky because they aren't always stable. On ridges, you can get swirling crosswinds. In narrow drainages, wind can tumble back and forth depending on shade and slope. That's why you should never assume. You got to carry your wind checker and use it constantly and adjust your position if something changes. A single shift in wind direction can undo hours of waiting. The other layer to consider is how terrain and wind combine to create security. Elk bed where they can hear above, see across, and smell all around. That three-part defense system makes them almost untouchable unless you enter from the right angle. This is why coming in from directly above or below bedding areas is often a mistake. The wind will give you away before you ever get close. Side hill approaches that use cover, shade, and favorable thermals are almost always a better play in October. When you put terrain and wind together, October hunting becomes less about calling and more about chess. You're not trying to talk elk into coming your way. You're anticipating how they'll use the land and how the wind protects them as they move. Then you're sliding into those routes undetected, setting up where you know they'll pass, and letting the mountain deliver them right into your lap. By October, the bulls are quiet, the cows are scattered, and most of the herds have settled into survival mode. This is when bedding to feeding patterns become your best play, and your strategies need to shift from aggressive September tactics to more disciplined October approaches. Let's break down the main ways to hunt these patterns. First, ambush setups. October is prime time for ambush hunting. Instead of running the mountains trying to stir up a response, the higher odds play is slipping into a travel corridor and letting the elk do what they're already going to do. This works especially well along narrow saddles, benches that connect cover to feed, and well-worn trails on the edge of timber. The trick with ambush setups is patience. You're not moving constantly. You're committing to the spot and waiting for elk to cycle through. If you've done your scouting right and picked a route with fresh sign, you're not hoping for luck. You're putting yourself on a proven path. Number 2, intercept plays. Sometimes you'll glass elk staging near a meadow or slipping out of a bedding area earlier than expected. In these situations, an intercept play can work. The key is to anticipate where they're going, not chase them directly. If you see elk feeding their way toward a pocket or a meadow, swing wide with the wind in your favor and set up on the downwind side of their travel line. They'll walk right into you if you get there before they do. Intercept plays require decisiveness, though. You can't hesitate once you see the movement, or you'll end up trailing elk instead of meeting them. Number 3 is still hunting travel corridors. Another October tactic is still hunting the edges of travel routes. Elk that aren't showing in the open may still be feeding just inside the timber, slipping along faint trails. They're moving slowly. You got to be glassing every pocket, and you got to stop often so that you put yourself within bow range of elk that would never step out in the daylight. The key here is discipline. Every step has to be quiet. Every pause has to be long enough for elk to reveal themselves. Done wrong, you bump elk. Done right, you get a shot at pressured animals no one else gets to see. Number 4 is spot-and-stalk adjustments. While spot-and-stalk is a September staple, it changes in October. You're not chasing screaming bulls anymore. You're working off of bed-to-feed cycles. When you glass elk at a distance, the smartest move is to plan a stalk based on where they're headed, not where they are. In the evenings, that might mean cutting them off between bedding cover and the meadow. In the mornings, it might mean swinging above them as they angle back into the timber. Spot-and-stalk is still deadly in October, but it's slower, more calculated, and built around patience instead of adrenaline. When you combine these 4 strategies, ambush, intercept, still hunting, and calculated stalks, you're not just chasing elk, you're hunting them where they have to move. That's what October is all about, not forcing opportunities, but positioning yourself in the flow of their daily survival rhythm. When October rolls around, a lot of hunters start to feel like the season is slipping away. The rut is fading, the mountains are quiet, and elk aren't acting the way they did a few weeks ago. That frustration often leads to mistakes. Mistakes that cost opportunities and send hunters home empty-handed. Let's walk through the biggest ones so you can avoid them. Overhunting the obvious spots. One of the most common mistakes is sitting on the same big meadow, wallow, or open slope that produced action in September. By October, elk know those places have been hammered. They might still use them occasionally, but almost always at night. If you're waiting in the wide open while elk are slipping through timber edges, you're basically hunting where they were, not where they are. October success often comes from finding the overlooked benches, tucked away drainages, and hidden feed patches everyone else ignores. The next mistake is misreading wind and thermals. Nothing ruins an October hunt faster than sloppy wind management. Elk are already on edge from weeks of pressure. If your scent hits them once, they're gone. A lot of hunters set up in the right travel corridor but don't think through how the morning thermals are dropping or how an evening switch will pull their scent back downhill. Others ignore swirling winds in saddles and side hills. October setups demand precision. If the wind doesn't work, you don't hunt that spot, period. The next mistake is moving too much during transition times. Elk in October don't give you wide open windows of daylight activity a lot of times. Their travel between bedding and feeding is short and efficient. Hunters who can't sit still blow it by getting antsy. They move just as elk are staging to come out, or they hike into bedding cover right when elk are easing back for the day. Patience is the name of the game. If you know you're on a travel route, you've got to trust it and let the elk move. Moving at the wrong time almost always ends with you bumping the very animals you came for. The next mistake is failing to adapt to changing conditions. October is a month of flux. Weather changes, snow starts to fly, feed shifts, and elk adjust quickly. A mistake I see a lot of hunters make is sticking to one plan even when the sign says otherwise. If tracks and poop are piling up in lower benches but you're still hiking alpine basins, you're hunting ghosts. Adaptability is everything. You've got to read fresh sign. Check where elk are actually feeding and shift your focus as conditions change. When you look at these mistakes side by side, they all come down to one thing: not hunting October for what it is. It's no longer the chaos of the rut, and it's not yet the full migration of November. It's a transition month. If you keep hunting like it's still September, you're going to miss opportunities. But if you learn to slow down, trust the wind, hunt overlooked cover, and let bedding to feeding patterns guide your setups, you'll turn a frustrating month into one of the most productive times of your season. October can feel like a strange in-between time in elk season. The bugles have faded, the chaos of the rut is behind us, and the elk seem to vanish into the timber. But if you know how to read bedding to feeding patterns, you realize they're not gone at all. They're just living differently. They're bedding in the thickest, safest cover they can find. They're feeding on whatever groceries are still available, from hidden meadows to shrubs and browse. And every single day, they're traveling between the two. That rhythm doesn't stop just because the rut does. When you understand that rhythm, October becomes one of the best times of the season to fill a tag. You don't have to hope for a bugle to give them away. You don't have to chase chaos across basins. All you have to do is identify where elk bed and where they feed and the narrow routes they use to connect the two. With discipline, patience, and respect for wind and terrain, you can set up in those travel lines and turn October silence into opportunity. And if you're ready to take your preparation and strategy to the next level, that's exactly what our Team Backbone membership is built for. This isn't just a discount club, it's an inner circle. You'll get exclusive monthly gear giveaways, direct access to me for personalized advice, a private community of driven hunters, and member-only content that covers mindset, backcountry strategy, fitness, and more. Plus, every team member gets a Backbone Unlimited shirt mailed out each month, gear you can't buy anywhere else. This is built for hunters who want to sharpen their edge and be part of a tribe that pushes them forward. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.